Welcome, my friends, to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm DC Gomez, and I'm thrilled you're joining me today for a fun conversation with a passionate author. We're kicking off the program, like it's our tradition, with a short reading from the feature book. I hope you guys enjoy it. Let's get started.
My name is Casey Grifant. I'm an author based in Southern California, and I write horror, fantasy, science fiction, and Weird West stories. I've mainly focused on short stories, and I've had those published internationally in magazines, anthologies, podcasts. But today I'm going to be reading from my debut supernatural Western novel, which is called Melinda West, Monster Gunslinger. It came out in February of 2023 from Bridget's Gate Press, and the story takes place in an alternate history where monsters poured into the Old West region, and we have a Bonnie and Clyde-like couple who roam the land and offer their exterminating services. But when this couple, Melinda and Lance, accidentally release a demon that steals souls, they find themselves caught in a supernatural war. So I'm going to kick off with just a few minutes from chapter 1, diving in, and here goes. Melinda never missed, not in her 29 years on this earth. But then again, she never dealt with giant flying scorpions before. She aimed at the two shapes above a cactus several hundred feet away, fired, and watched as one of the bodies dropped. Aside from being bigger than any insect on this earth ought to be, the scorpion's six back legs were webbed, giving them the oh-so-handy ability to become airborne. A calf-sized one flew through the air with its green-tipped tail poised directly toward her head. She slid behind a toppled boulder, dust whipping up and stinging her eyes as the scorpion soared past, its pincers outstretched. Its back legs brushed the tip of her wide-brimmed hat, caught a draft, and swept back toward her like a giant leaf in the wind. 4 sets of white eyes alongside its orange head, fixed on Melinda as it came back around. She sucked in a breath and fired her pistol again, praying the wind wouldn't shift. The bullet tore through the insect's shell, ripping open its soft insides. Its chitin shattered like it was made of fine china. Bright green goo splattered on the cacti and rocks around her. "These bugs ain't joking," Lance huffed as he crouched next to Melinda, his brown hat askew. The grooves along his mouth deepened as he rooted in his knapsack for a weapon, the blondish stubble on his chin dark with dust. "Never seen this many air scorpions before in one place, except in pictures. Looks like their guts will sting something awful." "Poisonous, no doubt," Melinda said. "Aunt Beatrice sure would love a sample. Bullets?" "Almost out," Lance said, and hoisted his rifle. "Bombs?" she asked. "Just the one," Lance said, as they both peered over the edge of the hill at the sharp drop leading into the mine. Hundreds of the orange and beige insects scuttled out of the mine entrance, agitated, it seemed, by Melinda and Lance's presence. The gash in the side of the hill was flanked by a steep rise in the earth around it, creating a bowl into which the scorpions poured. One of the creatures lifted its webbed legs to catch a gust of wind blowing toward them. Before it could take flight, Lance's shot rang out, exploding the bug into green goo. The rest of the scorpions in the pile chittered and clanked their pincers. Though they'd seen plenty of odd creatures in their line of work, this sound was one Melinda was sure would haunt her dreams. "We shouldn't have used all the bombs up in Old Rivers," Melinda said, and tucked a strand of dark hair back into her hat as Lance passed her the tacky bomb, one of Abel's inventions. "It did a pretty good number on those fire kettle, though," Lance said. "Splattered their guts like firework. Want me to toss it?" "Who has better aim?" Melinda responded. Lance chuckled and handed her the air-pressured blaster in the shape of a clunky gun. She said about the tedious process of loading it with the tacky bomb, a trap of hammered metal housing a custom explosive. Hooves thundered behind them. The local sheriff who had summoned them, named Gatsum or Gary or something like that, Melinda couldn't remember which, scrambled off his horse. He stared aghast at the mine, his badge flashing like a beacon in the morning sun. "What do we do?" the sheriff shouted, his eyes wide as his Mustang spots. He peered at the pit. Lordy help us, we got to evacuate. We're ruined. I told that Carson not to blow a hole in this godforsaken land. Couldn't wait for his hermit of an uncle to die so he could start mining. Easy, partner, Lance said. We've dealt with bigger bads than this, believe it or not. Any bug can be squashed, and we're the ones to do it. What do they want? The sheriff wiped his forehead before replacing his hat. Sometimes critters get it in their head to look for greener pastures, Lance said, so they wander out from the edge. We don't know much about that here, the sheriff sniffed. Melinda understood. Some folks didn't want to say the edge out loud from superstition. They did the best they could to ignore that no man's land of monsters nestled in the northern mountains. Even so, plenty of creatures swarmed out from the edge, taking up residence in the pockets of hills or lakes or wherever they could find food. But never this far south. First time we've seen critters this big way out in the dustlands, Melinda said. You got any idea why they ventured so far or how? Something disturbed them, maybe, Lance chimed in. Don't matter none, we'll teach them, the sheriff huffed. He reached towards his saddle and yanked out a mallet nearly the size of the horse's leg. Mighty fine-looking hammer, but I wouldn't do that, Lance said. Their blood's got a sting. The sheriff moaned. They're coming out. Melinda turned her sights back on the pit of squirming scorpions, more of which poured out of the entrance. She breathed, and the tiny muscles around her eyes relaxed. She fired the blaster, sending the tacky bomb soaring through the air. It stuck along the top of the wooden frame of the mining entrance. Melinda pulled out her rifle and steadied, putting the explosive in her sights. The mix of Abel's unique concoction of compressed gunpowder cake and one of his experimental potions would make the tacky bomb consume everything, natural or unnatural, in its path. So long, suckers, she thought. You picked the wrong place to nest. Hurry, the sheriff said as a fresh wave of scorpions crawled out of the mining entrance. A few lifted themselves up as the wind picked up again. What are you waiting for? He shouted. One thing, Melinda said. Got our payment? But they're about to swarm, the sheriff sputtered. Let's see it, she said without moving. What in Lord's name is she waiting for? The sheriff shouted. I'll do it myself. Lance spat out a small glob of tobacco. Most people can't make that shot there. I'd be surprised if I could, he said. Okay, your money's right here, the sheriff said, and pulled open the envelope wrapped in twine. Melinda waited until she heard Lance rip it open and the sound of his satisfied breath. She took the shot.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to Inside the Minds of Authors. I'm hoping you guys love the reading as much as I did because I want to know all about this book. Before we get started, if you're new to the podcast, go ahead and subscribe. You don't want to miss a single episode. We have amazing authors every week. And if you're interested in seeing the behind the scenes, go ahead, join the Patreon community, become a podcast junkie. Help us bring new and exciting authors to you every single time. So you're here for the author. Let's get started. Hello, Miss Casey. How are you?
I'm great. How are you?
I'm so happy you're here. Welcome.
Thank
I
you.
want to know all about the story. So let's jump in. Where did this story come from? What is it all about? Tell us.
So this story is what's called a weird Western, right? So it takes place in the Old West, but there's some supernatural element to it. Monsters, ghosts, that kind of thing. And growing up, I was actually not that interested in Westerns. I didn't become interested until I started playing a card game called Doomtown. And what drew me to the card game, it was set in this kind of Old West format, but it had a lot of really diverse characters in it and a lot of women characters. So it had like women gunslingers and lawmakers. And I thought that was really cool because I had not really seen that in the Old West setting before. Usually there's a love interest or a brothel worker. Like those are usually the women characters in kind of Old West stories. So that kind of spurred my imagination. And I wrote some of the official stories for that card game. And then from there, I thought, let me invent my own kind of Weird West universe. And that's where the origin of this gunslinging couple came into play, Melinda and Lance. And for Melinda, I really wanted to reverse the kind of stoic cowboy gunslinger archetype and gender swap it a bit. So that's her character. And her partner, Lance, is more kind of easygoing, the charmer. So they're a really fun juxtaposition. And I wrote several short stories with them, and they were well received and published. So I thought, let me try a novel. And it went well, and it's out there, and people seem to be enjoying it.
I am super excited for you. So congratulations, because you
Thank
started
you.
out telling us you specialize in short story. What made you decide to take the leap and say, you know what? I'm going to do a novel of all things. Why?
I had always enjoyed writing novels ever since I was a teenager. So I wrote like long pieces, never published. And then I hit a writer's block for maybe 5 years when I went to college and I was trying to figure out what to do with my life, and things were really unstable. And I felt really frustrated because I couldn't find the focus or time to commit to a longer piece. So I thought, let me try short stories with some of these characters I've been thinking about for longer stories. And I found I really enjoyed the short story art form. It's actually very different than a novel. Obviously, you have much more compressed space, but you still want to get the narrative arc in there. And it's all about trimming text. And I actually went to grad school for science journalism. So in journalism, you learn to really focus your writing and cut out all the unnecessary words. So that kind of went hand in hand too with short story writing, where you're really trimming everything out except the very necessary. So I've written dozens of short stories. And then when the pandemic hit, I had, like many people, a lot more free time at home. So I thought, okay, let me try the novel again. And I also just wanted like pure escapism, to fall into a different world that was not our world. And it was a good stress reliever. And I just wanted to write a fun adventure, kind of like Buffy or the Supernatural show, where there are monsters and high stakes, but it's not gruesome, it's not disturbing, it's more an adventure.
You nailed that combination so well with this book. Your characters are so much fun.
Thank
I'm like,
you.
yeah, I'm glad that she can shoot. I'm glad that she owns it. I'm glad that she's the one's like, can you make that shot? So much. It's not what you expect of the Old West, like you said. It's also not what you expect of a female lead, which
Mhm,
takes this story to such a huge new levels.
mhm,
What would your readers say when they actually got this book? Because I'm all excited, and I'm not even a Western fan. I'm like, oh my God.
Yeah, I would say most people who have been reading it have never read a Western or a weird Western before. And the consensus seems to be, oh, I've never read the genre before, but it was really fun and I enjoyed it. And I think the book also borders on fantasy. It's kind of fantasy horror combo. So I think fans of fantasy seem to enjoy it quite a bit, and also horror fans. But as I said before, it's not disturbing or truly scary. There's a lot of monsters, but so for kind of the horror fan looking to be disturbed, it's maybe not the best pick. But for those who want to go on this adventure and encounter lots of strange monsters and just kind of have this epic quest, I think those are the types of readers who will enjoy it.
As you transition from short story to the novel, what is one thing you learned that you're like, was not prepared for that?
It always takes longer than I want it to take. I'm sure that's really common. I'm like, oh, let me just get this out in a month, like do the fast draft and get it done. But even the fast draft takes me so much longer than it should, than I wish it would. But part of it is accepting the process, right? And not getting frustrated and doing what you can. And one thing I do is I do write kind of short stories and other pieces as I'm writing a longer novel. I try not to switch to another novel in the process, but more like the short stories when I need a break.
That's a really good mix, and also keeps you within the universe without letting you go too far out.
Right.
This
Yep.
story, you talked about it. Are you planning to do a sequel to this? So is this just a standalone?
It was important for me to write it as pretty much a standalone because I personally get stressed out with cliffhanger trilogies, because I don't know if I necessarily want to read every series in a book, but I also want the satisfying conclusion. So for this one, I wrote it as a standalone, but with enough kind of threads that it can go on. And I'm actually working on the second book now, kind of in the midst of it. And then I know what I want the third book to do, and then even the possibility for more after. But I didn't want to force myself to, oh, you have to write a trilogy. I can stop at any time and it won't be this big cliffhanger.
I love that. It's great for you as an author. It's also great for your readers. So you can pick it up, you can enjoy it. So the book you're currently writing, does your readership have to read book one to get into it? Or can they just pick up book two and be like, ooh, let's go from here? How is that working for you?
Yeah, that's really interesting because I wanted to write it so that you could pick it up and you don't have to have read the first one. But in practice, I'm finding it's a little tricky because you can't ignore the events of the first book necessarily. So I'm trying to find a good balance where you could pick it up and read the second and follow. You're not going to be lost. But I do think somewhat they're going to build on each other. I am writing them to be somewhat episodic. So each one is a self-contained adventure, but it's an interesting process. So I am seeing as I go along with the second book that probably it is best if people read the first book first.
I love the fact that you're able to say, like, yes, you can read second and be okay, but it will be much more beneficial if you go and pick up the first one.
Yeah.
Great
Exactly.
advice for everybody. For this book, because it's a weird Western as you were creating it, how do you came up with the idea for your monsters? Like, did you just saw a whole bunch of scorpions and like, we're going to go kill those? How did you decide on what to do?
Actually, the monsters, I think, are one thing people comment on and really seem to enjoy. I know one reviewer told me they were expecting like Bigfoot or vampires, but these monsters are completely unique and don't fall under the typical kind of monster tropes. So nature, for sure, is where I get a lot of inspiration. Insects, fish, they all have these really mammals, birds all have very strange attributes. When you read about these random species and some of the things they can do, they sound made up. So I will like mix and match pieces of that. For me personally, I grew up with a fear of insects. So those feature pretty heavily in the first book. A lot of them are bigger or just amplified in some way. For the second book, I'm focusing more on mammals. And probably the third will be more aquatic kind of fish monsters. That's the plan. We'll see if it works out that way.
You officially touched on some of my fears. I'm the girl that everybody knows, like, I can't do insects. I'm like, anything crawling, I'm like, oh my God, it's going to get me. So I'm loving the fact that you add this into your story and you embracing this part and truly having some fun with it. As you were developing your characters, what is one thing you realized that I'm like, oh, I really like this about them?
I would say a lot of the side characters have kind of interesting backstories that I touch on, but I don't go into too much depth. So for those, I'm doing kind of spin-off short stories or novellas. And that's been really fun, just kind of this world building. And because the world is so undefined, these side characters can have very complex backstories that I can fill in later. So that's been really fun. As for the main characters, Melinda and Lance, I really wanted to portray a stable, healthy relationship because I feel like so much of the time we're reading about a love triangle and like manufactured drama in relationships. And I personally, maybe because I'm older, I don't really have the patience for that. So I thought, let me just show a couple that is healthy and functioning. But in writing that, I realized, well, I still need to give them disagreements and conflict because that is part of a healthy relationship. I found places where they disagreed, had fights, and then kind of resolved the fights. And that was very interesting because I wasn't necessarily planning that.
I love your combination of bringing a real couple to the page, with also having some real disagreements. Because let's be honest, nothing is perfect in a relationship. So I love that. Tell me, Mara, you have been writing in multiple genres, multiple styles. What advice would you give an up and coming author? What would you tell them about this?
I think it's a good time to write in different genres. As authors, there's a lot of flexibility, especially if you're going kind of the indie route of self-publishing or small press. There are so many interesting small presses out there right now, focused on horror or sci-fi, and even more specific subdivisions. So for me personally, writing in different genres keeps things fresh, keeps me interested in the writing. And I think for readers, it can be fun as well. And it helps you find a broader reader base also.
For our listeners who are trying to figure out, all advice was always stay in your genre, don't go outside. You are a successful writer who's been trying different things and having fun. So, hey, it works really well. So, tell us about your projects. You mentioned book 2 on this series. What else do you have going on? What else is the fabulous Miss Casey working on?
Oh, too many things, right? So, yes, book 2 is a big priority. I have some side stories there. One project I would love to do is what I'm calling the Monster Almanac. So, I'm tracking all of the monsters I create for these stories, and I would love to find an artist and get illustrations done and maybe publish that as a little side piece. So a lot of things kind of in that weird Western realm. Aside from that, I have a collection of short horror stories I just put together. I'm going to start shopping that. Most of them were published in various forms. So this is kind of all of the stories in one place. The theme is sort of tales of the uncanny. So what lies beneath the surface or at the edges of shadows. So all of these short stories have something kind of supernatural, something outside of reality that happens. So that one, I have a novella that's a kind of a take on a ghost story. So it's a haunted bed and breakfast in New England and strange things happen. And that's all I'll say about that. And then another novel idea, which is sci-fi horror that's kind of on the further back burner.
I love the fact that you have all these projects coming and you have all these things that you can bounce between one another. So you have a really good balance of things. When you're working on your books, can you finish one book and then jump to the other, or do you manage multiple ones? We touched a little bit on it. I want to go back. How do you handle all of that?
So I definitely jump around. I would say the short story market will sometimes determine if I need to swap. So for example, I see a call coming up for a Weird West anthology. The deadline's the end of the month. I'm going to switch and focus on that and get that one done. It's a little challenging because I think all of us have felt, or at least those of us trying to write novels, some idea will come to you in the middle of the novel and you want to switch gears and write something totally new. And part of it is procrastination, right? Because you're in the midst of the difficult, messy first draft and it's hard work and your mind is kind of trying to get out of it. So it gives you these other cool ideas that you should go do instead. So part of it is resisting that, right? But also kind of keeping an eye out. And if there is a short story idea that comes to mind, I will stop and write that quickly because it's not a huge distraction. I could get a draft of that done in a few days and then come back to the novel. So I try really hard to keep the novel as the main thread, but then I'll branch out a little bit, do some other projects, come back. That's probably part of why it's taken me so long to finish.
Actually not bad. You have a really good process. And I love the fact that you're always looking for submissions. Where can I send my work to? Where can I shop it to? So I love that. How long does it take that process for you to say, okay, I have this 10 different places that I want to go to? How long does it take you to decide where you're going to submit your work to?
Longer than it should, right? I feel like that's something I wish AI could do the submission part for me. It is time consuming because you have to keep an eye out. There are email alerts you can get. Twitter has been traditionally a pretty good resource for me to find open calls. And then so you got to read the submissions of all of them, be familiar with the magazine or the publisher, and then format and submit. I mean, it is a grind and it takes more time than I wish it did.
This is a part of the business that most people forget. I'm like, somehow it has to go from the author to the print. And this is a process. So, oof.
Yeah,
So,
it's a good chunk of time.
I'm glad you are honest enough to know, like, this is take more than I could, because you could be writing. Instead, you're trying to format.
Exactly.
So congratulations. And I'm glad you're doing it because it's beautiful. Your work is so exciting. Tell us, Madame, where can our listeners find you? Where they can learn more about you and the books?
Yeah, so my website is just KC Grifant, GRIFANT.com. I'm also on the major social platforms, Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, TikTok at KC Grifant, GRIFANT. I'm starting to experiment with a few others like Substack. Those core ones I mentioned, I'm pretty regularly on and I'm happy to connect with readers.
Awesome. So listeners, trying to find a good book coming up, you need to check out Miss Casey and you can find her anywhere. So super easy. Make sure you follow her. Madame, before you leave us, are you ready for the lightning round?
Yes.
Super easy. Let's get this going. Easy peasy. Sweet tea or unsweetened?
Ooh, can I do a mix? A mix would be ideal. Half and half.
We can do that. That's a good one. Hiking or camping?
Hiking for sure.
Nice. Early bird or night owl?
My children are forcing me to be an early bird. If I could pick, night owl.
I like that it's not by choice, but okay.
Not at all.
Mystery or fantasy?
Fantasy.
Nice. Here's a little different. Let's see how you do. If you could have any career besides writing, what would you do?
Ooh, I have always wanted to be an astronaut. Like theoretically, I don't know about practically, but if it could be anything, I would like to go to space and just check it out.
Really good one. I love it. Nice. But do you have any closing remarks for us?
No, I think just readers should be open to trying horror and weird Westerns and those mashups because there's a lot of cool stories there, especially from small press. I've found so many unique tales and points of view I would never find just in a mainstream bookstore. So strongly recommend checking out the indie publishers, checking out your indie bookstores, and finding new stuff to read.
I love it. Listeners, go ahead and check out a new author. Make sure you look for Miss KC. That is going to be amazing. Madam, thank you so much for joining us. It's been so much fun. Thank you. Thank you for the awesome reading. I had a blast having you. To our listeners, go ahead, check her out, sign up for her website. Make sure you follow along all the fun things she has. And if you're new to the podcast, don't forget to subscribe. We're always better when we're growing together. And I'll see you all next week with another amazing author. Bye.